The gentle hum of the engine lulled Ethan into a trance as he neared the familiar turnoff to his suburban home. He was a day early from his business trip, and although exhausted, the thought of surprising his wife, Heather, filled him with a sense of anticipation. They had been married for 10 years, and even through their ups and downs, Ethan always believed their bond was strong. Tonight he had planned something special. In his suitcase, tucked between his shirts, lay 2 tickets to Italy, a trip they had talked about for years but never got around to. Their 10th wedding anniversary was just weeks away, and this trip was going to be the grand gesture to remind Heather of their love. As he pulled into the driveway, Ethan noticed something that made him frown. Heather's car was there, but parked next to it was a sleek, unfamiliar black SUV. His mind immediately began to offer innocent explanations. Maybe it was one of her friends, or perhaps a delivery, but the nagging sensation in his gut told him something was off. Ethan parked and stepped out quietly, careful not to make a sound. His plan to sneak in and surprise her now seemed childish, the tension in his chest rising with every step toward the front door. He hesitated, his hand gripping the door handle, contemplating whether he should knock or use his key. Choosing the latter, he unlocked the door as quietly as possible and slipped inside. The house was eerily silent. Too silent. Ethan stood in the foyer listening. There were faint noises coming from upstairs, the creak of floorboards and muffled voices. A woman's laugh, Heather's laugh. The sound echoed painfully in his ears, each note a dagger. That wasn't her usual laugh. It wasn't the one he was accustomed to hearing when they were together. This one was different, light, carefree, and tinged with a happiness that he hadn't seen in months. His feet moved before he could think, each step up the staircase feeling like a heavy stone, weighing him down. The closer he got to the bedroom, the louder the voices became. His stomach twisted into knots as his hand reached for the doorknob. The door wasn't fully closed, just slightly ajar, giving him a narrow view of the bedroom he had shared with Heather for a decade. Through the sliver of an opening, he saw them. Heather was lying in bed, her body barely covered by a sheet, her head resting on the chest of a man Ethan didn't recognize. The man's arm was wrapped possessively around her waist, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her skin. Ethan's world spun. His vision blurred as the tickets to Italy crumpled in his fist. The plans he had meticulously crafted, the memories they had built over the years, everything shattered in an instant. The room that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a prison, trapping him in the suffocating reality of his wife's betrayal. He should have stormed in. He should have shouted, demanded answers. But instead, Ethan found himself rooted in place, unable to move. The overwhelming shock of what he had just seen kept him frozen. His brain screamed for action, for justice, but his body betrayed him, refusing to obey. He turned, his movements robotic, and descended the stairs as quietly as he had come. Once in the kitchen, he collapsed into a chair, his mind racing with 1,000 unanswered questions. How long had this been going on? Who was the man upstairs? How had he missed the signs? His phone buzzed in his pocket, shaking him from his daze. It was a message from Heather. "Miss you, can't wait for you to come home tomorrow. XOXO. The words stared back at him, mocking him with their false sincerity. How could she lie so effortlessly, knowing that she was up there, tangled in the sheets with another man? The laughter upstairs resumed, echoing through the house, and Ethan could feel his chest tighten with anger. He had been blind, so blind. All the little moments that had seemed insignificant. The late nights she stayed at work, the sudden disinterest in their conversations, the intimacy that had slowly faded over the months. It all made sense now. Gripping his phone tightly, Ethan opened their shared text history, scrolling through their recent conversations. It was all so ordinary, discussions about grocery shopping, dinner plans, reminders to pick up dry cleaning. Nothing stood out, no red flags, just the mundane interactions of a couple whose lives had intertwined for years. Yet beneath the surface, an affair had been festering, unnoticed by him. Ethan sat in the dimly lit kitchen, his mind replaying the moment upstairs like a broken record. The man's hand on Heather's waist, her laugh, the intimacy between them. It was too much. His knuckles whitened as he clutched his phone, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him like a vice. He wanted to scream, to march back up those stairs and confront them, but something held him back. Maybe it was the disbelief, the sheer shock of realizing that everything he thought he knew about his marriage was a lie. Or maybe it was the fear of hearing her confirm it, that she no longer loved him, that she had moved on while he was still clinging to the remnants of what they once had. Taking a deep breath, Ethan made his way out of the house. The warm night air hit him as he stepped outside, but it did nothing to calm the storm brewing inside. His legs carried him to the car without thinking, and before he knew it, he was driving. He didn't know where he was going. All he knew was that he couldn't stay there, in the house where his life had just unraveled. He drove aimlessly through the quiet streets of the neighborhood, his mind racing faster than the car. He replayed the past few months over and over, searching for the signs he had missed. There had been little things, moments that now seemed so glaringly obvious. Heather's sudden interest in staying late at work. The night she would come home with a smile, but no real explanation. The time she seemed distracted when they talked, her phone always buzzing with messages she brushed off as work. How long has this been going on? Ethan's thoughts swirled. Who is he? And why didn't I see it? After what felt like hours, Ethan pulled into the parking lot of a small, 24-hour diner. The neon sign flickered in the window as he stepped out of the car and walked inside. The place was nearly empty, save for a few late-night regulars nursing cups of coffee. He slid into a booth in the corner, the leather squeaking under him as he sat down. A waitress approached, her pen poised over a notepad. "What'll it be?" she asked, her voice tired but kind. "Just coffee," Ethan muttered, staring down at the table. As she walked away, he pulled out his phone again and stared at Heather's message. "Miss you, can't wait for you to come home tomorrow. XOXO. He wanted to throw the phone across the room, but instead, he opened her social media account. Scrolling through her photos, everything looked perfect on the surface. There they were, smiling at family gatherings, posing during vacations, even a picture from last month when they'd gone to a friend's wedding. Heather, radiant in a dress that clung to her figure, him standing beside her, oblivious to the cracks that had already formed in their relationship. The waitress returned, placing a cup of coffee in front of him. Ethan thanked her with a nod, though he doubted the caffeine would do much to calm his nerves. He took a sip, the bitter liquid burning his throat as he fought to keep his emotions in check. "What do I do now?" he thought, staring out the window into the darkened street. He couldn't go back to the house, not now. And yet, he couldn't avoid the confrontation forever. Heather had to know he'd found out. She had to explain. A part of him wondered if this was salvageable. Could they still fix it? Could they go back to the way things were before the affair? But deep down, he knew the answer. Even if she begged for forgiveness, even if she said it was just a mistake, how could he ever trust her again? The phone buzzed in his hand. Another message from Heather. This time, it wasn't as cheerful. "I just woke up. Are you okay? You didn't call tonight. Let me know when you're back." Ethan's stomach churned. He hadn't expected her to check in so soon. The carefree woman he'd just seen upstairs with another man was now acting as though everything was normal, as if her world hadn't just collided with his. It made him sick. Without thinking, he typed out a response. "I'm fine. Out for a drive. Don't wait up." He hit send and stared at the screen, half expecting her to follow up with more questions. But after a few moments, the screen stayed dark. No more messages. Ethan leaned back in the booth, his mind clouded with indecision. He thought about confronting her tonight, catching her off guard while the guilt was fresh. But something inside him wanted more than just an emotional showdown. He wanted answers. He wanted the truth. And to get that, he needed to be calm, methodical, like he was in business. No matter how much the anger swirled inside him. He knew that if he confronted her in rage, she'd either shut down or twist the story to make herself the victim. No, Ethan needed to be smarter than that. He pulled out his phone again, this time searching for a private investigator. If he was going to confront Heather, he needed solid proof, not just a moment of weakness he'd witnessed through a cracked door. There was more to this than just tonight. This had to have been going on for longer, and he needed to know how deep it went. Within minutes, he found a local PI firm. He dialed the number, and after a few rings, a gruff voice answered. Greystone Investigations. Ethan swallowed hard. I need to hire someone. It's about my wife. The voice on the other end didn't hesitate. You got a name, a situation, anything specific? Yes. I have some details, but I need more. I need to know how long she's been seeing this guy. And if there are others. We can do that, the man replied, his tone matter-of-fact. Meet me tomorrow, early, 8 a.m. Bring any information you've got. We'll get started. Ethan gave a quick affirmation and hung up, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt like he had just crossed a line, one that there was no coming back from. But he knew it was necessary. He needed the full story before he could decide what to do next. As he sat in the empty diner, the weight of what was coming next settled on him like a heavy cloak. Tomorrow, everything would change. The next morning came too soon. Ethan had barely slept, tossing and turning in his hotel room, haunted by the images of Heather in their bed with another man. When his alarm rang, it jolted him awake, though he felt no less exhausted than the night before. He quickly dressed and headed out to meet with the private investigator, knowing that this was his only path forward. The PI's office was in a small, nondescript building downtown. Ethan parked outside and took a moment to steady himself before going inside. The office smelled faintly of stale coffee and cigarette smoke, the kind of place that reeked of late nights and hard truths. A tall, grizzled man in his late 50s stood behind the desk, dressed in a wrinkled shirt and slacks, his eyes scanning Ethan with the kind of world-weary detachment that only came from years of watching people's lives unravel. "You must be Ethan," the man said, gesturing for him to sit. "I'm Paul Greystone. Let's get to it. What have you got for me?" Ethan slid his phone across the desk, the message from Heather still displayed on the screen. "My wife's been cheating on me. I caught her last night, but I need more than that. I need to know how long it's been going on, if this is just one guy or if there's more." Paul finished for him, nodding as he picked up the phone. He scanned the message quickly, then set the phone down. "We'll need access to her phone, her emails. Does she use social media?" Ethan nodded. "She's on Facebook and Instagram. I don't know how much she uses them for this, but I can give you access." Paul leaned back in his chair, scribbling notes on a yellow notepad. "Good. We'll monitor her phone calls, track her movements. Any idea who the guy is?" "I didn't recognize him," Ethan admitted, his jaw tightening. "But he was comfortable in my house. Too comfortable. I need to know who he is." "We'll find out," Paul said, his voice steady. "This could take a few days, maybe longer depending on how careful she's been. But if she's been doing this for a while, she's bound to slip up." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. Days. That meant more waiting, more pretending like everything was fine while he waited for the truth to unfold. He wasn't sure how long he could keep it up, but he nodded anyway, knowing that this was the only way to get the answers he needed. Ethan left the investigator's office feeling hollow. There was no relief in knowing the wheels were now in motion. If anything, the waiting felt worse. The next few days stretched out like an eternity, filled with forced smiles and conversations with Heather that made his stomach churn. Every time she kissed him goodbye, before heading to work or texted him something sweet, it took everything in him not to confront her right there. But he couldn't. Not yet. He needed the proof. On the surface, life continued as usual. Ethan went to work, had dinner with Heather in the evenings, and tried to keep up appearances. But his mind was elsewhere, constantly replaying that night and the laughter he had heard echoing down the stairs. Even when Heather lay beside him in bed, he found himself wondering if she was thinking of the other man, if she was secretly waiting for her next opportunity to meet him. 3 days after his visit to the PI's office, Ethan got a call from Paul Greystone. "I've got some preliminary information," Paul said, his voice calm as ever. "Meet me in an hour. We need to talk." Ethan's heart raced. This was it. He had been bracing himself for this moment, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure if he was ready for what Paul had found. He left the office immediately, not even bothering to make an excuse to his colleagues, and drove to Paul's office. When he walked in, Paul was already seated behind his desk, a folder open in front of him. "What do you have?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Paul glanced up, his expression unreadable. "We've been tracking her phone and monitoring her movements for the past few days. She's been careful, No messages that are incriminating on the phone she uses at home. But we found something else. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. What do you mean? Paul flipped the folder around and pushed it across the desk. She has a second phone, one she's been hiding from you. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he looked down at the photos. They showed Heather walking into a cafe, where she met a man, the same man from the bedroom. She handed him something small, and he pocketed it. A second phone. The evidence was right in front of him, but still the reality of it hit him like a punch to the gut. She uses this phone for all her communication with him, Paul continued. We managed to intercept a few messages. They've been seeing each other for months, meeting up while you're at work or out of town. I don't think this is the only guy either. There are hints in some of the messages that there have been others. The room felt like it was spinning. Months. She had been betraying him for months, carrying on a life behind his back that he hadn't even known existed. The man in the photos was just one piece of the puzzle. How many others had there been? I can keep digging if you want, Paul said, his tone gentle. But I think you already have enough. Ethan stared at the photos in silence, the weight of the truth settling over him. His world had been torn apart, and yet, here was the proof he had asked for. The question was, what was he going to do with it? Ethan left the PI's office with a manila envelope full of evidence. Photos, transcripts of messages, call logs. It was everything he needed to confront Heather, but now that he had it, the decision weighed heavily on him. He knew he couldn't just walk in and accuse her. Heather was smart, manipulative even. If he wasn't careful, she'd twist the narrative and try to make him out to be the bad guy. Or worse, she'd lie her way out of it. He needed a plan. Over the next few days, Ethan meticulously prepared. He had already been living a double life of sorts, pretending that everything was fine while secretly gathering evidence. Now he would take it a step further. He started looking for apartments online, small places that would serve as a temporary escape once the confrontation happened. He didn't want to be trapped in the house with her any longer than he needed to be. More importantly, he needed to figure out how to handle the fallout. Heather had always been good at playing the victim, and he knew that if things got messy, she'd try to use their friends against him. He needed to get ahead of that, make sure people knew the truth before she could spin her lies. And then there was the legal side of things. He scheduled a meeting with a divorce attorney, someone discreet but effective, to make sure he knew his rights. He wasn't just going to leave and let her walk away unscathed. She had humiliated him, shattered the trust they had built, and she wasn't going to get away with it easily. The day of the confrontation arrived faster than Ethan had anticipated. He had rehearsed it in his head 100 times, going over every possible scenario. What would she say? Would she deny it? Would she beg for forgiveness? Ethan wasn't sure what to expect, but he was ready for whatever came next. It was a Saturday evening. They had plans to go out to dinner, but Ethan knew that wasn't happening. He sat on the couch, waiting for Heather to come home from a supposed lunch with a friend. In reality, she had been at a hotel with the man from the photos, something Paul had confirmed just a few hours earlier. The door creaked open, and Heather walked in, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Hey, babe," she said, dropping her purse on the counter. "You ready for dinner?" Ethan's stomach twisted at the sight of her, the way she could act so normal, as if nothing was wrong. He forced himself to stay calm, his hands resting on the manila envelope beside him. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady. Heather's smile faltered. "What's wrong?" He motioned to the chair across from him. "Sit." She hesitated but did as he asked, her eyes scanning his face for clues. "Ethan, you're scaring me. What's going on?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the envelope and opened it, pulling out the photos. One by one, he laid them out on the coffee table in front of her. The color drained from Heather's face as she looked down at the images, her mouth falling open in shock. For a moment, she was silent, her eyes wide as she tried to process what she was seeing. Then, she looked up at him, panic flashing in her eyes. "Ethan, I can explain." "Explain?" His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. "Explain what, Heather? How you've been lying to me for months? How you've been sleeping with someone else in our bed while I was away? How you've been carrying on a double life while pretending to be my wife?" She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she just stared at him, her eyes wide and filled with fear. "Who is he?" Ethan pressed, his voice rising slightly. "How long has this been going on?" Heather blinked, tears welling up in her eyes as she shook her head. "It's not what you think. Don't lie to me," he snapped, his patience wearing thin. "I have the proof. I know everything." She flinched at the sharpness of his words, but then her expression shifted. The panic gave way to something else, defensiveness, maybe even anger. "You've been spying on me," she said, her voice incredulous. "How could you do that? I can't believe you." "You can't believe me?" Ethan's laugh was bitter, incredulous. "Heather, you've been cheating on me for months. You've lied to me every single day, and now you want to make this about me? About what I've done?" Heather's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she looked away, her eyes fixed on the floor as the weight of her betrayal hung between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Ethan stood up, his hands trembling as he gathered the photos back into the envelope. "I'm done," he said quietly. "I'm leaving." Heather's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. "Ethan, wait." But he didn't wait. He walked past her, grabbing his keys from the counter and heading toward the door. He couldn't stay in that house any longer. Not with her. The life they had built together was over, shattered beyond repair. As he stepped outside, the cool evening air hit him, but it did little to soothe the fire raging inside him. He got into his car and drove away. The image of Heather's tear-streaked face burned into his mind. It was over, but the road ahead was far from clear. The days that followed were a blur of legal meetings, phone calls, and paperwork. Ethan had moved into a small, one-bedroom apartment on the other side of town, far enough from the house that he didn't have to be reminded of what had happened, but close enough to still function within his life. Heather had tried to reach out to him multiple times, leaving voicemails, sending texts, even showing up at his office once. But Ethan ignored her every time. He didn't want to hear her excuses, didn't want to give her a chance to twist the narrative. The truth was out, and that was all he needed to know. The next few weeks passed in a haze for Ethan. After confronting Heather, he had expected the worst, the anger, the accusations, maybe even a desperate attempt to win him back. But what he hadn't anticipated was how smoothly Heather transitioned into damage control. She had always been manipulative, but now she was strategic. Heather's first move was to reach out to their friends, painting a version of the story that made her look like the victim. She told them that Ethan had been distant, that their marriage had been struggling for a long time, and that her affair was the result of him emotionally abandoning her. Some of their mutual friends began to call, offering sympathy, asking questions that felt like thinly veiled accusations. "You weren't really there for her lately, were you?" one friend asked over the phone, his tone full of judgment. Ethan clenched his jaw, holding back the urge to lash out. "They don't know anything. They didn't see what I saw." But he couldn't spend his time defending himself to people who weren't willing to hear the truth. He needed to focus on the divorce. His lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Valerie, had already warned him. "She's going to try to make this ugly. The minute you file for divorce, the gloves came off. Expect her to fight for everything." And fight she did. Heather's counterclaim arrived a week after Ethan had officially filed for divorce. It was a carefully crafted document, filled with accusations that painted her as a neglected wife, a woman who had been forced to find comfort in someone else because her husband had grown cold. She was asking for alimony, half of their assets, and the house, claiming she needed it to maintain stability during the separation. "She's ruthless," Ethan muttered to Valerie during one of their many meetings. Valerie didn't flinch. "That's exactly why you hired me. We're not going to let her walk away with everything. Trust me." The legal battle was exhausting, draining Ethan emotionally and financially. His once quiet evenings were now filled with meetings with Valerie, reviewing documents, and preparing for court dates. Every time he thought about how easily Heather had flipped the narrative, a fresh wave of anger hit him. She had cheated, and yet she was the one trying to bleed him dry. But Ethan knew that Heather was only playing a part. Beneath the surface, she had to be panicking. One evening, Ethan sat in his new, sparsely furnished apartment, staring at the boxes he still hadn't unpacked. The emptiness of the space reflected the emptiness inside him. He picked up his phone and scrolled through old photos of him and Heather, vacations, holidays, birthdays. Each image felt like a punch to the gut. How did it all fall apart? He wondered, scrolling faster, trying to outrun the memories. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his sister, Sarah. She had been one of the few people he could still talk to during this mess. "How are you holding up?" she texted. Ethan hesitated before responding. He didn't know how to answer. Some days, he felt like he was handling everything well, like he was moving forward. But other days, the pain of betrayal was unbearable. Heather had been his partner for a decade, and now she was a stranger. "I'm managing," he finally replied. "The legal stuff is a nightmare, but I'm getting through it." Sarah called immediately. Ethan answered, grateful for the sound of a familiar voice. "Ethan, you don't have to do this alone," she said gently. "Have you thought about seeing someone? Like a therapist? I know it sounds cliché, but it might help." Ethan sighed. "I don't know. I don't even know where to start." "I can help you find someone," Sarah offered. "You've been through a lot. It's okay to need help. This isn't just about the divorce. It's about you healing from what she did to you." Ethan hadn't allowed himself to think about the healing part. He had been so focused on the logistics, moving out, the legal fight, keeping himself together, that he hadn't truly stopped to process what Heather's betrayal had done to him. The truth was, he felt broken in a way he couldn't quite describe. "Maybe you're right," he admitted. "I'll think about it." A few days later, Ethan received a call from Paul Greystone, the private investigator. He hadn't expected to hear from him again. After all, the confrontation had already happened, and the divorce was well underway. But Paul's voice sounded different this time, urgent. "Ethan, there's something else you need to see," Paul said. "I've been keeping an eye on Heather, as you requested, and I found something troubling." Ethan's heart raced. "What is it?" "Meet me in my office. I'll show you." Ethan's mind was racing as he drove over to Paul's office. What else could there possibly be? He had already seen the photos, the messages. What more could Heather be hiding? When he arrived, Paul wasted no time. He handed Ethan a new stack of photos, and this time, they weren't just of Heather with the man he had already seen. There were others, 2 different men, both meeting Heather at various locations over the past few weeks. "She's not just seeing one guy," Paul said, his voice grim. "She's been meeting up with multiple men. I've confirmed at least 2 others. This goes deeper than we thought." Ethan stared at the photos in disbelief. It was like a twisted game. Heather had been juggling multiple affairs, leading double or even triple lives. His stomach churned with disgust. "This is what you're divorcing," Paul said, his tone matter of fact. "It's not just about the one guy. She's been playing you for a long time." Ethan couldn't even find the words to respond. He felt like he had been punched in the gut all over again. Just when he thought he had come to terms with the betrayal, this new revelation hit him even harder. Heather hadn't just betrayed him once. She had done it over and over again, with different men, all while maintaining the facade of their marriage. "What do I do with this?" Ethan asked, his voice hollow. Paul leaned back in his chair. "That's up to you. But now you know the full story." Ethan left Paul's office in a daze, the weight of the new information pressing down on him. He had thought the worst was over, but now he realized that the betrayal went even deeper than he had imagined. Ethan sat in his car for what felt like hours, staring at the photos. The anger that had been simmering for weeks now reached a boiling point. Heather hadn't just destroyed their marriage. She had disrespected him on a level that was unimaginable. He could no longer see her as the woman he had married. She was someone else entirely, a stranger who had used him, lied to him, and then tried to ruin him in court. His phone buzzed again, another text from Heather. This time, it was more desperate than the others. "Ethan, please, can we just talk? I need to explain." The message filled him with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Explain? How could she possibly explain this? There was no explanation that could fix what she had done. There was no apology that could make up for the pain she had caused. Ethan knew that confronting Heather again wouldn't bring him peace. She had already shown her true colors, and he didn't need to hear more lies. What he needed now was closure, a way to end this chapter of his life and move on. But how? His mind raced as he considered his options. The divorce would take time, but there was no turning back now. He would see it through, and Heather would get nothing more than what the law allowed. He wasn't going to let her walk away with the house, with his money, or with any part of his life. And then there was the matter of their friends. He had stayed quiet for too long, allowing Heather to manipulate the narrative. But now he had the truth. He had the evidence. It was time for everyone to see who she really was. Ethan pulled out his phone and started typing a message. This time, it wasn't to Heather. It was to a group of their mutual friends, people who had been asking questions, people who had taken Heather's side without knowing the full story. The message was simple. You all deserve to know the truth. Heather has been cheating on me for months with multiple men. I have the proof. If you still want to believe her lies, that's your choice. But I won't be silent anymore. He attached a few of the photos that Paul had given him, the ones showing Heather with different men. He didn't care if it seemed vindictive. These people had been his friends too, and they needed to know what kind of person Heather really was. When he hit send, there was no going back. The truth was out. The fallout from Ethan's message was immediate. His phone buzzed nonstop with replies, some shocked, others apologetic. Friends who had sided with Heather now realized they had been duped, and they didn't hold back in their responses. Ethan, I had no idea. I'm so sorry I believed her. She made it seem like you were the bad guy. I feel sick knowing the truth now. Even a few of Heather's closest friends reached out, expressing disbelief at what they had learned. The illusion she had carefully crafted was shattering around her, and Ethan felt a grim sense of satisfaction in knowing that, at least in this small way, he was taking back control of the narrative. But not everyone reacted with sympathy. One message from their mutual friend Mark stood out. Ethan, I don't think airing this out in public is the right way to handle things. This should have stayed between you two. Ethan read the message with growing frustration. Of course, he thought, there would always be people who wanted to protect Heather, people who were too uncomfortable with the truth to acknowledge it. He didn't respond to Mark. Instead, he let the message sit there unresolved. He didn't need to justify his actions. He had lived through the betrayal. He had every right to expose it. After sending the message to their mutual friends, Ethan knew that the facade Heather had worked so hard to maintain would begin to crumble. He expected the fallout to be swift, but even he wasn't prepared for just how quickly everything would unravel. Within hours, Heather's attempts at damage control began to show. She started posting cryptic messages on social media, casting herself as the victim, hinting at emotional abuse and manipulation. The posts were clearly aimed at swaying public opinion, trying to salvage what little reputation she had left. But it didn't take long for people to start questioning her narrative. Ethan's phone buzzed again, this time with messages from some of Heather's closest friends. Ethan, we're so sorry. She's been lying to all of us. I can't believe I defended her. She's been playing us all. One message, however, stood out more than the others. It was from Heather's best friend, Laura, a woman who had always been close to both Ethan and Heather. Ethan had never suspected that Laura knew the full extent of what was going on, but her message hinted at something deeper. Ethan, I feel like I need to apologize. I've known about the affairs for a while. I just didn't know how to tell you. The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Laura had known? For how long? And why hadn't she said anything? He stared at the message, unsure how to respond. A part of him wanted to unleash his anger on her, to demand why she had kept silent while his wife had been betraying him. But another part of him knew that Laura was just another victim of Heather's manipulations. She had probably been guilted into keeping quiet, afraid of what might happen if she crossed Heather. After a long pause, Ethan finally responded. How long? Laura replied quickly. Since last summer. She confessed one night after we'd had too much to drink. I tried to convince her to come clean, but she said she wasn't ready to leave you. I didn't know what to do. I'm so sorry. Ethan's stomach churned. Last summer. That meant the affair had been going on for well over a year before he had even caught wind of it. Heather had been lying to him for so much longer than he had thought. He typed out a quick response. You should have told me. I get that you were stuck in the middle, but you still should have told me. Laura's response was almost immediate. I know. I made a mistake, and I'm so sorry. I just didn't know how to break it to you. Ethan didn't respond again. He didn't have the energy to keep the conversation going. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle on him once again. 2 weeks later, Ethan found himself sitting in a courtroom, facing Heather for the first time since their confrontation. The divorce proceedings had been moving at a slow crawl, with both sides exchanging legal blows through their attorneys. Today was the day they were set to argue over the division of assets, and Heather had made it clear that she wasn't going to go down without a fight. As Ethan sat at the plaintiff's table, Valerie, his attorney, leaned in and whispered, "Remember, stay calm. Let me handle the arguments. Heather's going to play the victim card, but we've got the facts on our side." Ethan nodded, though his nerves were on edge. He had prepared himself for this moment, but seeing Heather walk into the courtroom with her high-powered lawyer made his blood boil. She wore a somber expression, her eyes downcast as if she were the one who had been wronged. It was a performance, and Ethan knew it. The judge entered, and the room quieted. The proceedings began quickly, with both attorneys presenting their opening arguments. Heather's lawyer, a slick, well-dressed man named Gerald, painted her as the aggrieved party, a woman who had been emotionally neglected by her husband and forced into a position where she sought comfort elsewhere. "She has been a devoted wife for 10 years, Your Honor," Gerald said smoothly. "She was willing to work on the marriage, but unfortunately, the emotional abandonment she faced left her no choice but to seek companionship outside of the relationship." Ethan gripped the edge of the table, his anger simmering beneath the surface. The audacity of it all. Heather, who had been cheating on him for over a year, was now claiming to be the victim. But Valerie had warned him this would happen. Heather had nothing left but her lies, and she was going to use them to get as much as she could. When it was Valerie's turn, she was sharp and direct. She presented the evidence Ethan had gathered, the photos, the messages, the proof of Heather's multiple affairs. It was hard, undeniable evidence that left no room for debate. "Your Honor, this case is not about emotional neglect," Valerie said, her voice cool and authoritative. "It's about a pattern of deceit, betrayal, and infidelity. My client was the one who was wronged, and the evidence shows that Mrs. Carter has been leading a double life for months, if not longer." The judge listened intently, his expression neutral. But Ethan could tell that Valerie's arguments had made an impact. She had been meticulous in her preparation, and it was clear that the facts were on their side. When the arguments were finished, the judge called for a brief recess before making his decision. Ethan stood up and walked out of the courtroom, needing a moment to clear his head. As he stepped into the hallway, he saw Heather standing with Gerald, speaking in hushed tones. For a moment, their eyes met across the room. Heather's expression was unreadable, but Ethan could see the tension in her posture. She wasn't as confident as she had been when this whole thing started. The walls were closing in on her, and she knew it. After what felt like an eternity, the judge returned and called everyone back into the courtroom. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he took his seat. This was it, the moment that would decide how much Heather would get and how much he would lose. The judge's voice was steady as he delivered his ruling. "In light of the evidence presented, it is clear that the marriage has irretrievably broken down due to Mrs. Carter's actions," he began, his tone firm. "While emotional neglect may have been a factor, the overwhelming evidence of infidelity cannot be ignored." Heather shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her face pale. "As such, I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Carter. Mrs. Carter will not be awarded spousal support. The division of assets will be split equitably, with Mr. Carter retaining the marital home. Mrs. Carter will receive a portion of the joint savings, but the remainder of the estate will be awarded to Mr. Carter." Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had won. Heather wasn't going to walk away with the house or his money. She would leave with far less than she had hoped for, and her lies had been exposed in the courtroom for all to see. As the judge continued outlining the specifics of the ruling, Ethan glanced over at Heather. Her eyes were downcast, her expression one of defeat. For the first time in months, Ethan felt like he had taken back control of his life. The marriage was over, the legal battle was nearly finished, and Heather's manipulations had failed. The weeks following the court's decision were a blur of final paperwork, moving arrangements, and closing the last chapter of his life with Heather. Ethan had officially taken ownership of the house, while Heather had moved out and settled into a small apartment across town. The divorce was final, and the only remaining tie between them was the last batch of legal documents to be signed. Ethan spent most of his time at his new apartment, but he found himself returning to the house every now and then. It felt strange, walking through the empty rooms where so many memories had been made and now destroyed. He had thought about selling it, starting fresh somewhere else, but something held him back. Maybe it was the idea of reclaiming it for himself, of erasing the traces of Heather and making it his own again. As he stood in the living room one evening, surrounded by silence, Ethan felt a sense of closure that he hadn't expected. The legal battle had been grueling, and the emotional wounds were still fresh. But for the first time in a long time, he could see a way forward. He had thought about what Sarah had said about therapy, about healing. It was time to stop focusing on what Heather had done and start focusing on himself. The bitterness and anger that had consumed him over the past few months needed to be let go. It wouldn't be easy, but Ethan knew it was the only way to truly move on. A few days later, Ethan received an unexpected message from Heather. It was short, almost apologetic. "Can we talk? I just want to say goodbye properly. No tricks, just a conversation." Ethan hesitated. Part of him wanted to ignore the message, to close the door on Heather for good. But another part of him, perhaps the part that still sought some form of resolution, decided that it might be worth hearing what she had to say. He agreed to meet her at a cafe downtown. When Ethan arrived, Heather was already seated at a table near the window. She looked different, tired, worn down by the weight of everything that had happened. As he sat down, there was an awkward silence between them, neither knowing how to start. "I just wanted to apologize," Heather began, her voice quiet. "I know I hurt you, and I know nothing I say can make up for it, but I'm sorry." Ethan studied her face, searching for sincerity. He had spent months imagining this moment, wondering if Heather would ever take responsibility for what she had done. Now that it was here, he felt nothing. The anger, the hurt. It had been there for so long, but now it just felt like a distant echo. "I don't think an apology changes anything," Ethan said, his tone calm. "You made your choices, Heather. We can't undo what's been done." Heather nodded, her eyes downcast. "I know. I wanted you to know that I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't mean for it to destroy everything." Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You say that, but you kept making those choices. You kept lying. You kept cheating. You didn't stop until you were caught." Heather blinked, tears welling in her eyes. "I was lost. I didn't know how to fix things." Ethan shook his head. "You didn't want to fix things, Heather. If you had, you would have come to me. You would have talked to me instead of sneaking around with other men. But you didn't. You chose to betray me." The truth of his words hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Heather wiped her eyes and nodded, accepting his judgment. "I guess this is it then," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Goodbye, Ethan." Ethan stood up, his heart feeling strangely light as he looked down at her. "Goodbye, Heather." And with that, he walked out of the cafe, leaving her and their broken marriage behind for good. In the weeks and months that followed, Ethan focused on rebuilding his life. He started therapy, as Sarah had suggested, and found that it helped him process the trauma of the betrayal. Slowly but surely, the pain of what Heather had done began to fade, replaced by a sense of strength and clarity. He reconnected with friends, started going out more, and even began dating again. It wasn't easy. Trust was something he would have to work on. But Ethan knew that he wasn't going to let Heather's actions define his future. The house, once a place of pain, became a symbol of his new beginning. He redecorated, changed the furniture, and made it his own. It no longer felt like the place where his marriage had fallen apart. It felt like home. One evening, as he sat on the back porch with a drink in hand, watching the sunset, Ethan allowed himself a moment of reflection. The past year had been hell, but he had come out the other side stronger than he had ever imagined. He wasn't the same man he had been before Heather's betrayal, but that was okay. He was someone new, someone better. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Ethan smiled to himself. The storm was over, and he was finally free. A few days later, Ethan received an unexpected message from Heather. It was short, almost apologetic. "Can we talk? I just want to say goodbye properly. No tricks, just a conversation." Ethan hesitated. Part of him wanted to ignore the message, to close the door on Heather for good. But another part of him, perhaps the part that still sought some form of resolution, decided that it might be worth hearing what she had to say. He agreed to meet her at a cafe downtown. When Ethan arrived, Heather was already seated at a table near the window. She looked different, tired, worn down by the weight of everything that had happened. As he sat down, there was an awkward silence between them, neither knowing how to start. "I just wanted to apologize," Heather began, her voice quiet. "I know I hurt you, and I know nothing I say can make up for it, but I'm sorry." Ethan studied her face, searching for sincerity. He had spent months imagining this moment, wondering if Heather would ever take responsibility for what she had done. Now that it was here, he felt nothing. The anger, the hurt. It had been there for so long, but now it just felt like a distant echo. "I don't think an apology changes anything," Ethan said, his tone calm. "You made your choices, Heather. We can't undo what's been done." Heather nodded, her eyes downcast. "I know. I wanted you to know that I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't mean for it to destroy everything." Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You say that, but you kept making those choices. You kept lying. You kept cheating. You didn't stop until you were caught." Heather blinked, tears welling in her eyes. "I was lost. I didn't know how to fix things." Ethan shook his head. "You didn't want to fix things, Heather. If you had, you would have come to me. You would have talked to me instead of sneaking around with other men. But you didn't. You chose to betray me." The truth of his words hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Heather wiped her eyes and nodded, accepting his judgment. "I guess this is it then," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Goodbye, Ethan." Ethan stood up, his heart feeling strangely light as he looked down at her. "Goodbye, Heather." And with that, he walked out of the cafe, leaving her and their broken marriage behind for good. In the weeks and months that followed, Ethan focused on rebuilding his life. He started therapy, as Sarah had suggested, and found that it helped him process the trauma of the betrayal. Slowly but surely, the pain of what Heather had done began to fade, replaced by a sense of strength and clarity. He reconnected with friends, started going out more, and even began dating again. It wasn't easy. Trust was something he would have to work on. But Ethan knew that he wasn't going to let Heather's actions define his future. The house, once a place of pain, became a symbol of his new beginning. He redecorated, changed the furniture, and made it his own. It no longer felt like the place where his marriage had fallen apart. It felt like home. One evening, as he sat on the back porch with a drink in hand, watching the sunset, Ethan allowed himself a moment of reflection. The past year had been hell, but he had come out the other side stronger than he had ever imagined. He wasn't the same man he had been before Heather's betrayal, but that was okay. He was someone new, someone better. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Ethan smiled to himself. The storm was over, and he was finally free. A year had passed since Ethan walked out of that cafe, leaving Heather and their shattered marriage behind. In that time, he had rebuilt his life piece by piece, forging a new path for himself. The divorce was long finalized, and the storm of emotions that had once consumed him had mostly settled. Yet, as much as he had moved forward, the scars of betrayal still lingered, buried deep beneath the surface. Ethan's journey to healing had been anything but straightforward. Therapy had helped, but there were still days when the memories would catch him off guard. Something as simple as passing by the cafe where he'd met Heather for that last conversation, or seeing an old photo pop up in his social media feed, would stir feelings he thought he had left behind. But he had learned to manage it, to accept that the pain would fade with time, but never fully disappear. His therapist, Dr. Patel, had been instrumental in helping him navigate the complexities of his emotions. She had taught him that healing wasn't about forgetting what had happened, but rather about accepting it and finding a way to grow from the experience. That had been the hardest part, accepting that the life he thought he had with Heather was never what it seemed. Trust is fragile, Dr. Patel had said during one of their sessions. When it's broken, it takes time to rebuild, whether that's with others or with yourself. But you're not the same person you were before this, Ethan. You're stronger, more aware. And that's something to be proud of. Ethan had taken her words to heart. He had spent so long blaming himself for missing the signs, for not realizing what Heather had been doing behind his back. But over time, he had come to understand that the fault lay with her, not him. He hadn't been perfect, but he had been loyal. He had trusted her, and she had betrayed that trust. That realization had freed him in ways he hadn't expected. As Ethan continued to focus on rebuilding his life, he found himself drawn to new hobbies and activities, things he had always wanted to try, but never had time for during his marriage. He joined a hiking group, rediscovering his love for the outdoors, and even started taking photography classes on the weekends. It felt good to immerse himself in something that had nothing to do with his past life, something that was entirely his own. One of the most surprising developments came when he reconnected with an old college friend, Olivia. They had lost touch after graduation, but a chance encounter at a mutual friend's birthday party had brought them back into each other's lives. At first, Ethan hadn't thought much of it. They spent time catching up over coffee and reminiscing about their college days. But as the months went by, he found himself drawn to her in a way he hadn't expected. Olivia was warm, funny, and easy to talk to. Everything that had been missing in his relationship with Heather. One evening, after a particularly long day, Ethan invited Olivia over for dinner at his newly refurbished home. They had been hanging out casually for months, but something about that night felt different. There was a comfortable ease between them, a kind of effortless connection that felt so foreign after the chaos of the past few years. After dinner, they sat on the couch, laughing about old stories from their college days, when Olivia's tone suddenly shifted. She looked at him, her expression soft but serious. "You know, Ethan, I've been meaning to ask you something," she began, hesitating for a moment. "Do you ever think about dating again? I mean, after everything?" Ethan felt his stomach tighten. He hadn't been ready for that question, not so soon, even though he had considered it on his own. "I don't know," he admitted, leaning back against the cushions. "I guess I've thought about it, but I'm not sure I'm ready, or if I ever will be." Olivia nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I get that. You went through something really tough, but you've come a long way. You deserve to be happy, you know." Ethan met her gaze, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to entertain the possibility of happiness with someone new. The thought of opening his heart again was terrifying, but as he sat there with Olivia, he realized that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't as impossible as it had once seemed. Just when Ethan thought he had put the worst behind him, Heather reappeared in his life, uninvited, and as disruptive as ever. It had been over a year since their divorce had been finalized, and for the most part, they had stayed out of each other's lives. Heather had moved on. At least, that's what Ethan had assumed. He hadn't heard much about her, aside from the occasional gossip from mutual acquaintances, but it didn't bother him. He had moved on, too. Then one afternoon, while Ethan was at a local cafe grabbing lunch, he saw her. Heather walked in, looking almost exactly as she had the day they'd last spoken. Only this time, there was no pretense of remorse in her eyes. She spotted Ethan almost immediately and, to his surprise, walked straight toward him. "Ethan," she said, her voice dripping with a strange mixture of familiarity and boldness, as if no time had passed at all. Ethan's first instinct was to ignore her, but that seemed impossible now that she was standing directly in front of him. He sighed and gestured to the seat across from him. "What do you want, Heather?" Heather sat down, her eyes darting around the room before landing back on him. She smiled, a smile that Ethan had once found charming, but now saw as hollow. "I've been thinking about you," she began, her tone soft. "I know we haven't talked in a while, but I wanted to see how you were doing." Ethan couldn't help but laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You wanted to see how I'm doing? Seriously?" Heather shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I know things ended badly between us. I made mistakes, and I know I hurt you. But I've had time to think about everything, and I wanted to apologize again. I didn't handle things the way I should have." Ethan raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "You didn't handle things the way you should have? Heather, you destroyed our marriage. You cheated on me with multiple men, lied to my face for over a year, and dragged me through a nightmare of a divorce. What exactly are you apologizing for now?" Heather's smile faltered, and for a moment, she looked like she was about to cry. But Ethan had seen this performance before. He wasn't falling for it again. "I know I hurt you," she said quietly, her eyes glistening with tears that Ethan wasn't sure were real. "And I know I can't take that back. But I've been doing a lot of soul-searching lately, and I realized that I made a huge mistake." Ethan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "And what exactly do you want from me, Heather? Do you expect me to forgive you? To pretend like none of this ever happened?" Heather shook her head. "No, I don't expect that. I miss you, Ethan. I miss what we had." The words hung in the air like a bad joke. Ethan stared at her, incredulous. "You miss what we had? Heather, what we had doesn't exist anymore. You destroyed it." Heather bit her lip, looking away for a moment before meeting his gaze again. "I know, but I've changed. I'm not the same person I was when we were married. I've grown, I've learned from my mistakes. And I just thought, maybe we could try again." Ethan felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. Was she really asking for this? After everything that had happened, she had the audacity to ask for a second chance? "No, Heather," Ethan said firmly, his voice steady. "There's no going back. What we had is gone, and you need to accept that." Heather's face fell, her tears now flowing freely. "But Ethan, Stop," Ethan interrupted, holding up a hand. "You need to stop. I'm not the same person I was when we were married either. I've moved on, and I'm not interested in revisiting the past. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them." Heather stared at him, her expression one of shock and desperation. But Ethan wasn't moved. He had given her enough chances, enough of his time and energy. It was time to close this chapter for good. Without another word, Ethan stood up, leaving Heather at the table. As he walked out of the cafe, he felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. The final tie to his past with Heather had been severed, and he was finally free. Over the next few months, Ethan focused on the future. His relationship with Olivia had deepened, evolving from a friendship into something more. She had been patient, understanding that Ethan was still healing from the scars of his past, and she never pushed him to move faster than he was ready for. It was a quiet, comfortable relationship, one that didn't carry the weight of expectations or deceit. One afternoon, Ethan and Olivia took a weekend trip to a quiet cabin in the mountains. It was the first time Ethan had taken a trip with someone since his divorce, and it felt like a significant step in his journey of healing. As they sat on the porch, watching the sunset over the mountains, Olivia leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder. "You know," she said softly, "I'm really glad we reconnected." Ethan smiled, feeling the warmth of her presence next to him. "Me too. I know you've been through a lot," Olivia continued, her voice thoughtful. "But I want you to know that you don't have to carry it alone. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent so long guarding his heart, afraid of being hurt again, that he hadn't fully allowed himself to trust someone new. But with Olivia, things were different. She wasn't trying to fill the void that Heather had left. She was creating something new, something better. "I appreciate that," Ethan said quietly, his hand finding hers. "It's been a long road, but I'm finally starting to feel like I'm ready for whatever comes next." They sat in comfortable silence, the quiet of the mountains surrounding them. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt at peace. He had been through hell and back, but he had survived. He had found a way to heal, to rebuild, and to open his heart again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan realized that this was what moving on truly felt like. It wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending that the pain hadn't existed. It was about accepting it, learning from it, and finding the strength to keep going. He wasn't the same man he had been before Heather's betrayal. He was stronger, wiser, and more resilient. And as he sat there with Olivia, he knew that he was ready for whatever the future had in store. The day Ethan signed the final paperwork for the sale of the house, he felt a strange mix of emotions. He had decided to sell it after all, realizing that, despite the changes he had made, it still carried too many memories of his life with Heather. It was time to let go completely. Standing in a now empty living room, Ethan took one last look around. This house had been the place where his life had fallen apart, but it had also been the place where he had begun to rebuild. Letting it go felt symbolic, like the final step in closing the door on that chapter of his life. He handed the keys to the new owners and walked out, feeling lighter with every step. As he drove away, he didn't feel sadness or regret. Instead, he felt a sense of freedom, of possibility. The past was behind him now, and the future was wide open. Years later, Ethan would look back on this time in his life as a period of immense growth. What had started as the darkest chapter of his life had transformed into something beautiful, an opportunity to learn, to heal, and to create a new path forward. His relationship with Olivia continued to flourish, and they eventually moved in together, building a life that was filled with trust, love, and mutual respect. It wasn't perfect, no relationship ever was, but it was real, and it was healthy. And for Ethan, that was enough. He had once thought that Heather's betrayal would break him, but in the end, it had made him stronger. It had taught him the importance of self-worth, of setting boundaries, and of never settling for less than he deserved. As he stood on the porch of his new home one evening, watching the sunset with Olivia by his side, Ethan smiled to himself. Life had taken him on a journey he never could have predicted, but it had led him exactly where he needed to be. The storm was over, and he was finally free to live the life he had always deserved. The day Ethan signed the final paperwork for the sale of his old home, he felt a strange mix of emotions. It wasn't just the house he was letting go of, it was the last physical tie to his past with Heather. Standing in a now empty living room, he took one last look around, letting the memories wash over him for the final time. This had been the place where his life had once fallen apart, but it was also where he had begun to rebuild. Now it was time to start fresh. The sale of the house symbolized the final chapter of his old life, a life weighed down by betrayal and pain. As Ethan walked out the front door and handed the keys to the new owners, he felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. His relationship with Olivia continued to grow stronger. She had become not only a partner, but a source of comfort and trust, everything he had been searching for. Together, they made new memories in their new home, one that wasn't haunted by the past. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Olivia turned to him with a smile. "I'm glad we're here," she said softly. "It feels like the start of something beautiful." Ethan took her hand, feeling the warmth of her touch and the quiet joy that had settled into his life. "It is," he replied, squeezing her hand gently. "It really is." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan knew that this was his new beginning, the life he had always deserved. And that's how it ended. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment your thoughts below. Tell us, what would you have done in their shoes? And stay tuned for the next tale, because trust me, things are only going to get more intense. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.